Alright, welcome back, Sebastian here. So time for my power rankings for the 2025 Azerbaijan Grand Prix. So starting right away with driver number 20, I think this was probably one of the easiest driver number 20s I've had to do all season. In fact, probably one of the easiest I've had to do in the history of this channel. And that is none other than Oscar Piastri. So from Piastri, qualified P9. The only positive I can say about his weekend is that he got himself into Q3. Of course, then crashed out in Q3, didn't set a time, so officially by my count, out-qualified by his teammate Norris by 1.2 tenths of a second. That was his Q2 time. Then in the Grand Prix, pretty eventful Grand Prix for what he competed in. False start off the line, then had kicked an anti-stall, and then of course crashed 5 corners into the Grand Prix. So probably not a difficult question, but almost certainly the worst race of Oscar Piastri, still relatively young F1 career. So number 19, I think not a difficult one as well, and that is Alex Albon. Qualified P19 I should say. Technically was P20. Knocked himself out of qualifying with a bit of a rookie mistake. Basically just broke the suspension going turn 2 early into turn 1. In a weekend where Williams had a very good car and his teammate put that to good use. Out-qualified officially by his teammate by 1.1 seconds, obviously not representative as Albon went out pretty early in qualifying. But for Albon, finished P13 in the Grand Prix, so did make up quite a few positions, but another bit of an oopsie there with that collision with Colapinto, given a 10-second penalty. Ultimately didn't really change much at the end of the day, as he wouldn't have scored points anyway. But yeah, all in all, a pretty poor weekend from Albon. Alright, number 18 is Nico Hülkenberg. So for Hülkenberg, this is kind of where things got a little bit more difficult in terms of ranking drivers. I think the bottom two are pretty easy, but I think Hülkenberg was, I would say, kind of worst of the rest, if you will. So for Hülkenberg, qualified P17, out-qualified by his teammate Bortoleto by 4 tenths. Very close to what I predicted, actually, so a bit of a surprise there. And then in the race came home to P16, so still pretty far off of his teammate. Bit of a clattering with Esteban Ocon on the opening lap of the Grand Prix. Again, it was just a racing incident, so I'm not really punishing him from that. But he did crash in qualifying, did bust a front wing. So again, not great on that count. Again, pace has not been very good. Basically ever since he got that podium at the British Grand Prix. So it's almost like he's got that clear podium that he's been chasing for so many years. He's basically in the kind of Kimi Raikkonen hobby mode, it seems. Alright, number 17 is Esteban Ocon. So for Ocon, qualified 20th. Technically he got thrown out of qualifying for an illegal part on his wing and still had a bit of a shocker in qualifying. I think he originally qualified P17 on the road, I want to say. But regardless, out-qualified by his rookie teammate, Oliver Behrman, by 3.4 tenths of a second, so pretty big gap there. And then came back to a P14 on an effective zero-stop strategy. Similar to Albon, basically pitted, on lap 1 under the safety car, then went the rest of the way on that one set of tires. So again, a bit of a fortuitous strategy, I should say, in a race where there's very little tire degradation. So again, a pretty poor weekend, I would say, for Ocon. Now, number 16 is Lance Stroll. A weekend where so many drivers crashed out, and Stroll's not one of them. A bit of a surprise there. Stroll, bit of an anonymous weekend, qualified 14th, out-qualified by his teammate Fernando Alonso by 1.2 seconds, I should say. Quality gap was obviously pretty big, but I'm giving some drivers a bit of the benefit of the doubt with some of the gaps in qualifying, just because we know that because qualifying was so stop-start, that a lot of drivers were just only able to get like one lap in per qualifying session, and so that means that you had a lot bigger gaps. And even when you look at Stroll's gap in Q1, it was a lot closer with Alonso. So again, probably just poor conditions, and but obviously not great for Stroll. Then in the race, gambled on a red flag or a safety car, didn't come, and so he came home for P17 on the road. Alright, P15 is Franco Colapinto. Qualified 16th, out-qualified his teammate Pierre Gasly by 3.6 tenths of a second. So just looking at the raw times, qualifying was pretty good. He out-qualified his teammate. The bad news for Colapinto was that he crashed out of qualifying and basically caused qualifying to end early. So without that crash at the end of Q1, would have probably ended up quite a few positions higher, but a bit of a clumsy crash there by Colapinto drops him down. In the Grand Prix, looked like he could have finished maybe, I would say, from somewhere between 11th and 15th. He looked like he might have been able to get, but unfortunately spun around by Albon, a bit of an unfortunate one there, and he ends up finishing 19th on the road. P14, I'm going to put his teammate. I think his teammate didn't have a particularly spectacular weekend either. Out-qualified by Colapinto, like I said before. And then, of course, had a bit of an oopsie at the end of qualifying that, while, of course, he didn't crash, he basically completely just lost his last lap. Basically went down one of the escape roads, and that was kind of the end of that. In the Grand Prix, finished 18th. And yeah, pretty poor weekend overall for Alpine, a weekend where I figured they were going to struggle. Low downforce, but also a very bumpy track, something that they apparently really struggle with this year. Hopefully, I don't think Singapore is going to be much better, but hopefully when we get to some of the more purpose-built tracks, I think Qatar, maybe Abu Dhabi as well, those are tracks that should be a little bit better for the Alpine car. Alright, P13 is Fernando Alonso. So for Alonso, qualified 11th, out-qualified Stroll, like I said, by 1.2 seconds. So again, qualifying was about pretty good, I would say, for Aston, given that again they haven't been very good on these low downforce tracks this year. In the race, unfortunately, I did have to penalize him a bit for that false start, reacting not to the lights, but unfortunately to the McLaren of Piastri in front of him. So I did have to bump him down a little bit for that, and in the end, came home for P15. Alright, P12 is our first of the point scorers, and that is Isaac Hadjar. So for Hadjar, qualified P8, which I think under normal circumstances would have been a pretty decent result, but unfortunately out-qualified by his teammate Liam Lawson by about 5/10 of a second. So a bit of a qualifying gap that's a little bit too big, a lot bigger than you would like. And again, the race pace, I think, actually, of Hadjar was not so bad. Finished P10 on the road, but very close to the Lawson train behind. And so the fact that, even though there was a massive difference in starting position, the fact that they finished, relatively close together on track does suggest that, I think Hadjar's race pace relative to Lawson was not so bad. And again, that's something that he can take from this race. Okay, number 11. So number 11, we have Charles Leclerc. So a bit of a surprise, I would say, to have Leclerc this low down, but again, it was a really scrappy weekend for the Ferrari driver. Qualified P10, so out-qualified his teammate Hamilton by 6/10, but again, a bit similar to Stroll. I think a lot of the quality gaps in Q2 were quite all over the place, just because of how limited the running was. And yeah, Hamilton, I think, definitely got caught out by a bunch of the red flags, so it wasn't entirely representative of the pace difference, I think, between the two drivers. I'm sorry about that. But nonetheless, Leclerc Q3 crashes out. A bit of a clumsy mistake there, and that definitely, drags him down on this list. And it's part of the reason why he ends up behind his teammate. In the Grand Prix, first opening stand, the race was honestly not so bad. Nice overtake on Norris at the restart, but unfortunately didn't really quite have the pace of his teammate towards the end. But I do think a lot of that was because of the strategy he was on. But nonetheless, still P9 on the road would have been P8 if Ferrari had been successful in reverting the order of their cars. But again, a bit similar with Colapinto. I felt like I had to bump him down a little bit more just because of the crash that I had in qualifying. All right, number 10 is Lando Norris. So for Norris, qualified P7, out-qualified his teammate, like I said, but it still felt like this was a big missed opportunity for Norris. In terms of the fact that, his teammate had a shocker of a weekend and he only gained 6 points on him, which is less points than he would have gained if they had finished 1-2 in the Grand Prix. So this was a weekend where he could have taken easily double-digit points out of his teammate, but was not able to do so. So I think definitely a missed opportunity for the British driver. Ultimately, 7th in qualifying, I think definitely should have been somewhere near pole. I would say definitely top 3, top 4. I think is where Norris should have qualified. I know there's a bit of an excuse with the fact that he was the first driver out on track at the end of the session, but he also had a pretty big mistake hitting the wall at turn 15. In the Grand Prix, there was some good parts and there was some not so good parts. The good parts were that his pace was generally pretty good. And given the circumstances with the fact that overtaking was so difficult, I think there was points where his pace was relatively strong. And again, he had some bad luck with the slow pit stop, but there were some other moments that were some, real head scratchers, like the fact that he was basically asleep on a safety car restart, got completely, smoked by Leclerc, basically taking that position on the restart. So again, there were some, pretty iffy moments there by Norris overall in a weekend where it felt like, I think the win would have been difficult with the form that Verstappen was showed this weekend. But I think this was a car that definitely could have been on pole, and I think it could have won the Grand Prix. And unfortunately, the fact that Norris is 7th, I think for me really suggests that he did underperform quite a bit, even if he did have a much cleaner weekend than his teammate. Okay, number 9 is Yuki Tsunoda. So for Tsunoda, qualified 6th and then finished the Grand Prix in 6th. Now the gap in qualifying was much bigger than you would ideally like. It was basically about a second off his teammate Verstappen. And given that this was basically a 2023-esque performance by Verstappen and Red Bull, it means that you kind of have to judge things by 2023 standards and not by 2025 standards. If this was a race where Verstappen had finished 4th, 3rd, 5th even, Tsunoda I think could easily have been maybe in the top 6. But the fact that this was a weekend where Verstappen was as dominant as he was, I think shows that, if this was Perez doing this kind of performance, I think there would have been still a lot of questions, and we were kind of clowning on Perez for, finishing just outside the podium when Verstappen was winning Grand Prix by 20 seconds that year, which was, of course, basically what happened today, this past weekend. But that being said, big step forwards for Tsunoda relative to his past performances, and we'll see if this can carry forward. And again, the hope is that, Tsunoda can gradually can continue to get closer. I think his fate in terms of Red Bull, I think, is already sealed. I think he's probably going to lose his seat for 2026. And I think he still has a shot of keeping a spot in F1, but it seems like it's going to be between himself and Lawson for that basically team leader role at Racing Bulls. All right, number 8 is Oliver Bearman. So for Bearman, I think maybe a bit of a surprise I put him this high. But in terms of the Class A and Class B, he was one of the better performers I felt in that Class B. Qualified 15th, I think brutally unlucky that it was barely a crash. He basically tapped the wall on the outside of turn 2, I think it was. And there were drivers who had much heavier hits than that who were able to continue on. So I think compared to some of the other crashes we saw, like with Piastri, Leclerc, Hülkenberg even, I'm giving Bearman a little bit more leeway here because it was one of those ones where the action and the consequences, it felt like, didn't really match up a whole lot. I think it was, quite a bit of bad luck there on Bearman's part that a tap that light basically broke his suspension, even if it was, a bit of a small mistake. That being said, still outqualified Ocon by a sizable margin of 3/10. And then in the Grand Prix, a bit of a decent comeback to P12 on the road, which I think is pretty close to what the best that he could have done out of that done this weekend, just given there was such a massive gap between Hadjar in 10th and a driver who's yet to show up on my list who finished in P11. Okay, number 7 is Lewis Hamilton. So for Hamilton, qualified 12th, like I said, but I think quite a few mitigating factors that meant that the qualifying gap was much bigger than I think it really should have been. Then in the Grand Prix, I think solid pace. I think did have a bit of a beneficial strategy, but still, I don't think it was a terrible job and it was relatively error-free, which is something that can definitely not be said of his teammate, who I think had a pretty messy weekend. Even though there's, I think, 3 drivers between the two of them, it felt like they were relatively close. It's just I felt like I had to punish Leclerc more for the mistake that he made in qualifying. Okay, now we get into the top row, into 6th place. In 6th place, I have Kimi Antonelli. So for Antonelli, qualifying went very, very well. Qualified 4th, outqualified his teammate by 3.5 tenths of a second. I believe the second time in a Grand Prix, outqualified Russell. That being said, the one caveat with that is this was a weekend where, Russell was definitely seems like he was feeling quite under the weather. So of course would have not been in great shape for qualifying. And apparently, according to Toto Wolff, it was touch and go whether or not they would need to put Bottas in for the race. So not ideal there for sure. And again, that's a little bit of a mitigating factor that kind of goes against Antonelli. But still, I think relative to some of the races he's had recently, it is a big improvement. I guess for whatever reason, he seems to really not like racing in Europe. as we finally leave Europe, and Antonelli has a pretty solid result once again, kind of showing some of the form that I think he had in the first third of the season or so before we went to Europe. Okay, yeah, and I think finished fourth in the Grand Prix. I think I mentioned that already. Now, moving on to number 5, I think a very unsung performance this weekend. That was Gabriel Bortoleto. Qualified 13th, out-qualified his teammate Hulkenberg by 4/10 of a second. Very, very good job there. I think came pretty close to maximizing the pace of the car. And then in the Grand Prix was basically best of kind of the Class B of the bottom 4 teams. Finished 11th on the road, miles off the points. But still, I think a pretty solid job. I think a little bit helped by the fact that so many of the front runners had such scruffy weekends. The fact that he was able to finish 5th on my power rankings despite not scoring points. But I think that's just the nature of the way of the beast sometimes. And sometimes you'll have weekends where a driver of that caliber is, really rewarded, and other times it won't be rewarded as much. Okay, now into the top 4. Number 4 for me is Liam Lawson. So for Lawson, qualified third, out-qualified his teammate Hajar by about half a second. Very, very, very strong performance in qualifying. Arguably, I think, not even arguably, I think easily his best performance in qualifying. I think the closest that you could really go is Brazil last year, where he qualified 5th in the wet conditions. Then in the Grand Prix, he came 5th, which I think still career best result for him, but I think he will be a little bit disappointed. I think a podium was always going to be virtually impossible with both Mercedes there. But I think P4 was definitely possible, and I think without that slight mistake, with the energy, the ERS fighting Antonelli, I think he probably could have held on to 4th place. And again, the race pace, I think, a bit unusual for Lawson. The race pace was a bit of a struggle. Usually, the race pace is much easier, comes much more naturally to him. But this was a weekend where it felt like kind of the opposite of what we normally have. Hajar was the stronger. It felt like Hajar was a slightly stronger driver in the race, and Lawson was the stronger driver in qualifying. But still, I felt really, really good job to defend against the faster cars behind. And yeah, I think 5th is pretty close to what he could do, but I think 4th was possible. So moving into the top 3, and you'll notice that's the exact same drivers that we have on our podium, but is the order the same? Is the order different? Well, let's see. So number 3 is George Russell, so a little bit different from the actual podium that we had. So for Russell, qualified P5, out-qualified by Antonelli, like I said. A little bit lucky that, a 3/10 gap in qualifying is only 1 position difference, I think. Qualifying, I think, was definitely kept Russell from being higher, but I think regardless, it was going to be really, really hard to get past the top 2 just because the top 2 had very, very strong weekends. And then in the Grand Prix, very, very solid race, and that brought him home to a P2 result, and that's why I put him in front of Lawson, despite the fact I think the qualifying was a little bit iffy. So, moving on to the top 2. So, number 2, I have Carlos Sainz, and number 1, I have, of course, Max Verstappen. So, for Sainz, qualified P2, a little bit of luck involved. I would have been interested to see if we had a very normal, clean Q3 where Sainz ends up. I don't think he qualifies top 3. Maybe he could challenge, 5th, 6th or so. But regardless, took advantage of the very, very tricky conditions, which Sainz seems has a habit of being able to do that. And yeah, out-qualified his teammate by over a second, which again, not representative because his teammate crashed out, but still you have to be there to pick up the pieces. And then in the Grand Prix, very, very smart Grand Prix in a car that I felt was pretty close to the Racing Bulls. Maybe it's a little bit better, but still, the race pace difference between himself and Lawson was pretty noticeable. So even then, the race pace I felt was very, very strong, and just a little bit unfortunate that he kind of had to let one of the 2 Mercedes pass him on track. And yeah, came home to a very, very solid P3, his first podium at Williams. Now, the reason why he's not P1 is because, unfortunately, P1 got a Grand Slam, got a Grand Chelem, and that is, of course, the combination of race win, pole, fastest lap, and leading every lap. Very, very rare in F1. And that is, of course, Max Verstappen's 6th of his career, which actually ties Lewis Hamilton's career total in about 130, 140 less races. But for Verstappen, excellent race, not much more you can say, basically perfect. Put the car on pole, out-qualified his teammate by a second, led off the line with basically ease, controlled the pace, excellent pit stop, strategy was basically flawless, and then came home for an excellent result. And I think many people are discussing that this has basically put him in a outside shot of the podium, or not the podium, of the title. And I think, at this point, it's pretty big outside shots. I think if you looked at where Norris was last year with the balance of where the cars were, the Red Bull last year versus McLaren last year versus McLaren this year versus Red Bull this year, I think Norris last year was in a better position at this point than Verstappen is right now. So I think it's going to be a lot of work. And basically, if he manages to pull this off, it's going to be probably... I'm too young. I think someone a little bit older would have to, give a bit more of a definitive answer on this, but I think it would probably go down in history as the biggest comeback in F1 history, just in terms of the title. But again, that's really a question for another day. And I think Singapore is going to be a big make or break in that regard, given that it's a much different track. It's a high downforce compared to the last two that we've had, which are, of course, low downforce. But still, excellent result by Verstappen, did everything right, and he's rewarded with number 1 in my power ranking. So, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.